Psalm 24 is a psalm for the occasion of the Ark of the Covenant being brought up to Jerusalem. Now, David had conquered the city of Jerusalem and had set up his residence there, but one thing was really missing in his thinking, and that was the presence of God in the form of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was sitting outside the city, and he made actually a couple of attempts to bring it up. The first one was unsuccessful. That's a whole other story. But when it was ultimately successful, then the Ark of the Covenant was brought up and set up in the tabernacle adjacent to David's palace. And so this psalm would have been a liturgical psalm, a psalm for the community to sing and recite and worship with as this joyous occasion of bringing the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem for its final home there, and to sort of symbolically enthrone God in the city of Jerusalem. It's classified as an entrance psalm by genre. There are only two of these psalms, Psalm 15 and Psalm 24, that have this classification. An entrance psalm is a psalm that's used for worshipers as they approach God in his temple. So a psalm about approaching God in some way. It is a liturgical psalm, and so it is a psalm that does some teaching as the congregation recites it. It begins with a declaration that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, so a statement of theological reality. And then it asks a question, who may enter God's presence? Who may ascend the hill of the Lord and stand in his holy place? The answer to that question is kind of twofold. The answer first is in verses 4, 5, and 6 in terms of the worshiper, the type of worshiper who may enter into God's place. But it is resoundingly answered in the final four verses as the King of glory is the one who can enter. And indeed, that's probably referring then to the Ark of the Covenant, which was seen as the very throne of God entering into the city and into the tabernacle. I'll highlight here the names of God. Yahweh occurs 6 times in the psalm. Verse 10 also adds the Yahweh Sebaoth, the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the angel armies is typically how we think of the Lord of hosts. A couple other names of God in verses 5 and 6. He is the God of his salvation and the God of Jacob, probably inserted there for some kind of poetic variety perhaps. In terms of the 3 movements of the psalm, or the 3 theological statements that are made here pretty clearly, is first that God is the God of creation, and the opening declaration confirms that. Then also he's the God of covenant. He is a God of relationship who enters into relationship with his people. And then he is God enthroned. He is king, and he is enthroned in his temple, which is located in the city of his people, Jerusalem. Now we'll take a look at it line by line and dig into it a bit more. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all who dwell in it. So we're referring here to the physical earth and then all the people who inhabit it as well. So it's just a way of saying in Hebrew poetry, parallel statements of God, the totality of God's sovereignty. It belongs to him. Why? Well, for he founded it upon the seas and he established it upon the waters. He created it. He created it, so it's his by right of his making it. And you may wonder, what is this about he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers? Because we know from geology that if you dig down into the earth, you hit the earth's core, which is metal. It's not water. But think about how we experience this whenever we dig a water well or we observe a spring. And so this was the natural thinking in the ancient world, that the earth was founded upon water, because any place you dig, ultimately, you're going to hit water, right? So the earth must be resting on the waters. And so that's just a simple explanation of that phenomena. Verse 3 is in the form of a catechism. Catechism teaches through using questions. So there's a question and an answer. Who shall ascend? Who shall stand in his holy place? This is kind of an echo of Psalm 15, which asks a very similar question. Who may dwell? Was the question in Psalm 15 in the place in the house of the Lord. The answer is verse 4. He who has clean hands. So this refers perhaps in 2 senses of that word. First, there was a ritual cleaning that took place, a washing of hands. In Psalm 26, David will say, I've washed my hands in innocence as I go about your altar. So there's the ritual cleaning, but probably, certainly more than that is the representation of outward acts, because that's in contrast to the pure heart. So we might say he who is clean both outwardly, clean hands and their actions, as well as inwardly, their purity of thought, heart, of motivation. So both inward and outward, they're pure. They do not lift up their soul to what is false. This is a reference to idolatry. They don't pray to idols. They don't pray to other gods. They don't worship other gods, and they don't swear deceitfully. They don't lie, whether that is swearing. This may be the idea of swearing by the name of a false god, or simply swearing, not intending to keep your promise. Such a person will receive blessing from Yahweh and vindication from the God of his salvation. So this is the idea of covenant being expressed here, blessing and righteousness coming as a consequence of clean hands and a pure heart and exclusive devotion to Yahweh. So covenant, mutual obligations. God will bless, God will vindicate if we will live in relationship with him. This section then ends with a salah, with a pause in verse 6, and then an invitation for the gates and the doors to be opened so that the King of Glory may come in. Now you may ask, what is the head of a gate? Lift up your heads, O gate, it says. The heads refer to the beam that went across the top of the gate. You had two side posts and then a heavy beam over the top. And even to this day in construction, when we construct a door or a window, the beam that goes over the top of that is called a header. And so this would be the beam over the gate. And perhaps the idea is here that don't just open up the gates, but open up even the headers. Someone so big, so great is entering that the current space is not large enough for it. So enlarge the space, O gates, so that our great God may enter. O gates, be lifted up, you ancient doors. Because these two are in parallel with one another, the common thought is that this refers to the gates of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was an ancient city. David conquered it from the Jebusites. It had been around since perhaps even the time of Melchizedek, who was identified in Genesis 14 as the Melchizedek, the priest of Salem, the king of Salem. So perhaps this is a 1,000-year-old city, which is that's pretty old. So probably qualifies for being an ancient door. So it's possible it's a reference to Jerusalem. It's also possible that this is a reference to the temple gates. Now the temple had not been constructed yet. This is during the time of David, as we know. So temple hasn't been built until Solomon builds it. So now it could be that this was edited later to incorporate the idea of the doors of the temple, or perhaps David here just has in mind this spiritual temple that has not yet been physically constructed on earth, but it is surely where God dwells in the midst of his people, in the tabernacle. So the tabernacle didn't technically have doors, it was a tent, but perhaps in a sense it represented God's heavenly temple. There's also some thought that this could even be a reference to the Garden of Eden, where God dwelt with Adam and Eve. He walked with them, and then, of course, they were banished from that, and the place then was guarded by cherubim. That the way in to the presence of God, the Garden of Eden, was now barred, was now blocked, and so perhaps this is the ancient door that is being opened, the temple doors, with the Garden of Eden as a prototype of the temple. And it's been observed that the temple itself, the tabernacle, its furnishings, all were in some ways representative of the Garden of Eden. If you think about it, there's a table of bread that represents provision, fruit, the fruit of the trees. There was a lampstand that was in the shape of a tree, a branched candlestick, right? And there was, of course, tree in the garden. So there's some that's a whole nother subject, but consider that as a possibility as well when we talk about the ancient doors there. Then also we have, again, this form of catechism, this question. Just as in verse 3, we had the question of who may enter. Now we have the question, who is this king? So we've invited the king to come in verse 7 and verse 9. And then the question is asked twice, who is this king? And then the question is answered, the Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. And we have this description of Yahweh as the great king with his angel armies that is coming to inhabit his temple and his city.